I want to be really clear that I'm not anti-El Salvador. I'm not anti Bukele. I think that it's important that we have a discussion about this. And I'm worried that that's not happening. And I'm worried why that's not happening, right? Like, why is this self-censorship so prominent? Because a lot of people are reaching out to me and saying, thank you for speaking up. I don't feel comfortable doing this.
Okay.
So I'm glad you are. This would have been such a great symbol that a small country with conviction could stand up against an organization like the IMF. That is not the signal anymore. Now the signal is, well, everybody eventually gives in.
Thank you so much, John, for being with me today. It's lovely to be with you on camera and to talk on record about all the things that's going on in El Salvador right now. Before we jump in, I do just want to say a really quick shout out to Sovereignty Studios. This is the wonderful studio that we find ourselves in. So thank you, Sovereignty. And they do accept Bitcoin, which a lot of El Salvador doesn't. And we're going to get onto that later as well. So, John, you founded My First Bitcoin, or Mi Primer Bitcoin. You're wearing the t-shirt to prove it. How are you today, and how are you feeling?
I'm good today. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Nice, man. And you drove me here as well. So shout out to John, the driver, for bringing me to Sovereignty Studios. Okay, the purpose of this podcast and this discussion we're going to have today was to get to know the IMF law a bit better, or the IMF impact, on the Bitcoin legal tender law. And also to get involved with Bitcoin education in El Salvador.
Yep.
And then I think we're also going to talk about funding too, as that was a last sort of topic point. But before we get there, I want to understand the picture of you from when you were, was it 18, 19 years old?
19, yes.
So you were 19 years old and you were protesting about an IMF discussion. Is that right?
Yeah, I was protesting their annual meeting.
Their annual meeting. Okay, so is it fair to say that you have had a long-standing understanding and a long-standing sort of distrust of the IMF?
Yeah, to put it lightly, about the distrust part. So when I was 19 years old, then I became very involved in activism. And for me, ever since then, and I'm 42 now, so this has been more than 2 decades, the IMF has represented what is wrong with the world, right? And they represent that because they are this opaque power that dictates to so much of the world how to behave, what to do, what's acceptable, what's not. But they do it in ways that are often hidden from the public, and that's by design. So I think they symbolize for me so much of what's wrong with the world, and Bitcoin symbolizes so much of what we could do differently, what we could do better. So when they come into conflict, that is something that I feel very strongly about.
Okay. How were you so alert to that at such a young age? Because like for me personally, I learned about the IMF through living in developing countries like, the Ivory Coast or Trinidad and Tobago. And you suddenly realize that this really impressive, influential, powerful institution is effectively getting poorer countries into these deals, and then it sort of leverages that debt to coerce and then to an extent to influence power. And obviously we'll come onto that in El Salvador. But it took me a long time to understand that. And of course, like Alex Gladstein, the CSO of the Human Rights Foundation, he's something high up in the Human Rights Foundation. He wrote this great book called Hidden Repression, which is all about the IMF. And so I think there's been a sort of steady awakening to how bad this institution is. But why were you so alert to it at such a young age?
Yeah, so when I was 18, or even when I was 19, I was not very alert to it, but the change that happened was September 11th, right? I'm from New York originally, and when September 11th happened, then it impacted me deeply, and it made me take a big step back and look at the world and try to see what was wrong with the world and how we could create a better future. And one of the first things that I saw is the problem with the world is that people, and I continue to see this is like the motivation behind me, Bitcoin and basically everything that I do in my life, is that if people feel disempowered, then there are serious negative consequences of that. And if people feel empowered, there are likewise very positive second order effects of that. So like I did a lot of thinking, like, why do things like September 11th happen? And it's because people don't have an outlet. They don't feel empowered to express themselves. And when you take that away from people, then it will still come out, but it will come out in unpredictable, sometimes violent ways. And the IMF was then and continues to be perhaps the best representation of an elite, opaque organization that takes power away from people, that disempowers them. They disempower nation states.
Can you point to any? I mean, I was going to ask you about the link directly between 9/11 to the IMF, because it feels like quite a jump. What do you have to go down there to connect these two? Well, this, one of the most important events of this millennium, and also the IMF. How do you get from one to the other? And I'm just going to get my notebook out if anyone's listening to some rustling, because I forgot to get it out. Bad journalist.
Again, I think the problem then, and the problem continues to be, that individuals do not have agency in their own life. And, that starts at the top. And if you go to the very top, then it's organizations like the IMF that not only benefit from that status quo, but actually create it.
Just benefiting. No further than that. They're benefiting from the status quo, and they're also creating it.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So this status quo in which the individual doesn't have agency in their own life.
Yeah.
That is something that organizations like the IMF benefit from, but they also maintain that status quo, right?
Yeah. So the purpose of getting all this explanation about the IMF is because we're going to come on to the El Salvador and IMF being in cahoots right now. I don't know if we can say that Bukele's got into bed with the IMF. Maybe I won't be invited back into the country if so. But the other thing is that, of course, you founded My First Bitcoin in El Salvador. Why did you feel the need to do that? What was the opportunity you saw? And what motivated you to found this company? It's not a company, is it? It's an organization.
We're a nonprofit.
Nonprofit, yeah.
So in 2021, so the pandemic was, I didn't know we were going to go so deep into the background, but that's great. Like context.
We need the context.
Context is important.
And we can have the context. It's a podcast. So
yeah, let's do it. So another big moment for me was the pandemic, right? The pandemic was another global moment that was a very potent reminder that individuals of the world don't necessarily have agency in their own life. And again, there are significant second order effects to that. Positive if they are empowered, and negative if they are disempowered. And that was more obvious than usual during the pandemic. So I did a lot of thinking, long walks while it seemed like the world was collapsing, and thinking about what can we do. So much of my life as an activist, it was me trying to push against what I saw as bad. Bitcoin is an opportunity to lift up what is good. So the same problem that the world is, or many individuals in the world don't have agency in their own lives. They don't have sovereignty. And the negative consequences of that are, it makes it difficult to plan. It makes it difficult to look into the future if somebody else is writing the rules that you have to abide by. If somebody else is defining the frameworks of the future on a schedule that is not transparent, not predictable, then it makes it hard to build, to create, to plan, to start a family, to start a business. Even it's not very motivating to even educate yourself, right? Because who knows what skill sets are going to be useful in 20 years, right? Like somebody else is deciding that, not me. So again, it was it just highlighted that problem in the world. And I did a lot of thinking, like, what is the solution? And for me, the solution is Bitcoin, is introductory Bitcoin education, because Bitcoin is a paradigm shift. It's a different way. The real revolution of Bitcoin is not that it could be a better money. That's great. And there's a lot of positive knock-on effects from that. But for me, the real revolution of Bitcoin is it changes how you can relate to power, right?
Interesting.
Like, it's not, you don't have to ask permission. You can control your money, which means that you could control your power, which means that you have more control over your present and therefore more control over your own future. So that's the real revolution of Bitcoin in my eyes, is that it could change your relationship and how you view your relationship to power itself. So with that in mind, Bitcoin education, especially introductory Bitcoin education, it's the first step on this journey, right? And if done correctly, then it sets you on a different path. It sets you on a path where you have more agency in your own life, more sovereignty over your future. So I had that thought already. And then when that was still quite fresh in my mind, then El Salvador in June 2021, they announced, which is kind of the tail end of the pandemic, they announced that they were going to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender and become like the Bitcoin country. And that, despite the fact that I am pretty anti-government, right? I'm not like very pro-state by any means. It felt like a very important moment in history that as the first nation to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, to really go out on a limb and do this, there was going to be a lot of attention on the country, and it was going to set a lot of precedents. Like, whatever happened in El Salvador was going to echo around the world for Bitcoin adoption, for better or for worse. That was pretty clear to me from day one when they made the announcement. So then my second thought was, well, if this is so important, I'd like to, contribute to making sure that this is a positive example for the world. And again, I think the best way to do that is through Bitcoin education. So I moved here in August of 2021. So the way that law works here in El Salvador, the law needs to be published in the official gazette, and then it goes into effect 90 days later, which is perhaps relevant for the IMF discussion. The law was passed, but it is not yet in effect to rescind legal tender. So it was passed in June 2021, and it went into effect in September 2021. So I moved here in August. So I wanted to get a bit of a feel for life in El Salvador before that, which is also, maybe will be relative later why I'm so impassioned by these changes that are happening here, because I'd literally quit my job, sold all of my possessions, said goodbye to my family, and moved here because I thought this law was a signal, right? This law was like, okay, this is an important place that is going to make history, and it's so important that we hold our ground, right?
Yeah, we had that conversation. I think I was in Morocco at the time, and I was interviewing you. I think it was for a Cointelegraph article. It was like the first time I met you remotely.
Virtually, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember saying, like, yeah, I want to come work for my first Bitcoin. Like, I used to be a teacher, and you're probably going to hold me to that at some point. But maybe we won't be doing it in El Salvador. Maybe we'll be doing it in something else. But you mentioned just how important or significant that news was for your own personal life, and there are lots of Bitcoiners who have done a similar thing. They've not just moved here, but they've moved their families here. They've moved their businesses here. They're looking to start businesses here. Shout out again to Sovereignty Studios. We're in a clearly a nice studio that was a big investment, a big outlay for people that saw a future for Bitcoin in El Salvador. And as you point to, it was a signal. This Bitcoin legal tender law was a signal that Bitcoin was here to stay. Can you just talk to the fact that, your family is here as well, right? Was your son born here, or?
My son was born here, yeah.
Okay, so your son is Salvadoran and American.
Yeah.
Or is that even allowed? I don't know how it works.
Yeah. He actually has dual citizenship.
Oh, you can do it. Okay.
But my son was born here. My girlfriend is Salvadorian. Like I'm quite rooted here, right?
Yeah.
This wasn't just a layover, right? This wasn't a stop. This is I uprooted my life and put new roots down here.
Okay. And yet, so let's come to the news then. As I understand it, the IMF loan, which is $1.4 billion, I think.
Yeah.
Bukele agreed this, or the government of El Salvador agreed this with the IMF on the condition that some of these legal tender laws would be repealed. And the wording is sort of quite interesting in parts. Would you be able to explain it, like how you perceive it right now? And also, I think it's important to note that the IMF has been hounding El Salvador for years about the legal tender law. Like if you go back through you know, news articles about IMF in El Salvador, and it used to be a sort of something that Bitcoiners would brag about. Bitcoiners would be like, oh lol, the IMF is trying to crack the whip on El Salvador, and Bukele is tweeting, oh no, we don't want your money, or oh no, we don't need you, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And there's this element of like, yeah, it was braggadocious almost. And now in 2025, some people are saying that Bukele has bent the knee to the IMF.
Yes.
So I think that there's another tiny bit of context we need. But yeah, what's the legal tender law? What's the repeal like? How do you interpret these very, very small changes within the wording of these laws? And what does it mean?
So the government here, one thing that attracted me to it was that they spoke openly about this, like as specifically about the IMF, that the IMF was a neo-colonial structure and that, you know, we're nobody's colony anymore. We're going to forge our own path. We're going to go our own way. We don't need the IMF. That's part of the old world. That was the messaging that they very boldly, aggressively, loudly talked about with the IMF, which is something that I resonated deeply with. Not saying that anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
And do you think the omission is self-censorship, or they can't say it anymore?
They can't, right? I mean, it would make, for them to say the same message that they said 2 years ago now, it would make them look like massive hypocrites, which they are, right? Like
I was waiting for you to say
if you say X is bad, X is bad, X is bad, and then all of a sudden, you know, you're not supporting X, right? Well, in a way they are, right? They're giving legitimacy to the IMF. This would have been such a great symbol that a small country with conviction could stand up against an organization like the IMF. That is not the signal anymore. Now the signal is, well, everybody eventually gives in.
Okay. Okay, we'll talk about the actual repeal to law in a second. Why are there people who are either self-censoring or, you know, omitting this part of El Salvador's future? And why are there people who appear to be supporting this new change?
Well, I mean,
that live in El Salvador.
Yeah, a complex answer there. There could be people that just aren't anti-IMF, that are okay with the status quo, that don't have a problem with that. I think there are other people that see this more pragmatically, like El Salvador needed money and the IMF had money, so that's just how it is. That's how the world works. I don't see Bitcoin as, well, that's how the world works. I see Bitcoin as an opportunity to create a different world, right? Not to just keep going on the same path that we're on. I see it as an opportunity to diverge from the path. But why are some people that otherwise would not be very friendly to the IMF, why are they quiet, right? Maybe that's more the question. So this is not in my best interest to speak out against this, right? Like, we're a nonprofit, and this, to rock the boat in our host country.
You're putting on your My First Bitcoin hat there. You're not being John Dennehy anymore. You're actually, when you say we, you're referring to My First Bitcoin. I just want to make that clear.
Yes. Yeah. But most people here who are building, who came to El Salvador to build something, they have the same concerns, right? They're like, well, we want to have a good relationship with the government, and we want, if our business is built around Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador, it doesn't serve our interests to bring attention to the fact that there are challenges, right? And like, I want to be really clear that I'm not anti El Salvador. I'm not anti Bukele. I think that it's important that we have a discussion about this, and I'm worried that that's not happening, and I'm worried why that's not happening, right? Like, why is this self-censorship so prominent? Because a lot of people are reaching out to me and saying, thank you for speaking up. I don't feel comfortable doing this.
Okay.
So I'm glad you are.
Yeah, you've been tweeting a series of tweets since day one of the law change. You know, we're now on day 13. Is that right?
Day 13. Yeah.
Day 13, where you've been, using your voice to, speak truth to power. And I think, it's important to note there that a lot of people don't or haven't done the work on the IMF, or just haven't looked into the IMF to realize that it is quite an awful piece of sort of fiat machinery.
That's probably part of it too. I think many people don't. And even Bitcoiners, this is something that surprised me. I think I had an assumption before that Bitcoiners just knew that the IMF was the enemy, that the IMF was bad. What I've come to realize is that there are many Bitcoiners who think of the IMF as a big bank. Not like, maybe they don't love big banks, but the IMF is much more malicious, nefarious, and evil than a big bank.
Yeah. It's the bank of banks, the banker's bank.
Yeah, but I mean, the IMF is not in the business of giving loans. The IMF is in the business of exerting control. Debt is the way that they do that. Debt is a means to the end. That is not their business.
Okay. And yet you do have, I spoke to Mike Peterson a few days ago about the IMF, and he was much more sort of, just take it as it comes. And he's since tweeted, he didn't say this on the pod, but he said, this is basically a nothing burger because, as I mentioned, the minutiae of these law changes are so small. So like, can you make that argument to me? Can you does that resonate at all with you? Or is this a lot more malicious than what first appears?
Yeah. So if we just look at it as the details of the changes, I would be totally fine with them, right? Like Chivo, for example, which was the government Bitcoin application, needs to be either sold off or closed down. Chivo was always a terrible application that gave many people a very negative first experience into Bitcoin. That's great. But that is winding down, or somebody else will take it over that could maybe do a better job with it. There are many things as part of the law changes that if El Salvador did it on their own, I don't think I'd care, right? I'd be like, okay, yeah, I see, maybe like legal tender is something that I have mixed feelings about, because on the one hand, and maybe it's worth defining what legal tender is. Legal tender means that this currency must be accepted to satisfy a debt. It doesn't mean that people have to accept it, but it means that it could clear the debt, right? Typically with both private and public parties,
right?
Which was it was never enforced here. Like, there were many businesses that never accepted Bitcoin. And there were government agencies many that did accept Bitcoin, probably not 100%, but that they were like on the path to, right? Like, I know I paid for my residency with Bitcoin. I paid when I got off the plane to enter the country with Bitcoin, that like fee that you pay, or the tourist tax, whatever it is. So the government is now explicitly prohibited from accepting Bitcoin. And for private parties, Bitcoin is still legal, so they will be able to transact in Bitcoin on a voluntary basis if both private parties agree to it, but no public parties can participate in that, right?
Okay.
So Bitcoin's legal now. It moved from being legal tender to being legal.
Right.
And I have mixed feelings about legal tender because, maybe legal tender laws shouldn't exist, period. for any currency, Bitcoin, dollar, like
like Argentina or Javier Milei has just done in Argentina, right?
yeah.
You can
So
settle debts with anything effectively.
right, and I think that so long as both parties agree to it, right, and there's also benefits to legal tender, right? It gives the currency credibility and legitimacy on an international stage. It also has tax benefits. So if it's recognized as a legal tender by international institutions, including the IMF, then there are certain benefits that regarding taxes, regarding just legal benefits there.
Mm-hmm.
So there's pros and cons. I have mixed feelings about legal tender, but the point is that I wouldn't be opposed to these changes if El Salvador made them on their own.
Right.
What I am opposed to is that the IMF is dictating to El Salvador how they should run things here, specifically in regards to Bitcoin. And what a lot of people don't realize, this isn't a one-off.
Okay.
Right? So the way that the loan is structured, the specific loan, it will once the preconditions are met, so they're still in the stage of meeting these preconditions, which was the law change and selling Chivo, and there's a number of preconditions to get to the starting line. That's the phase that we're in now. We're just getting to the starting line. The agreement hasn't gone into effect yet. Once it goes into effect, then the payments will be dispersed over a 40-month period. So about 3.5 years. Well, that is active, then the IMF will have a seat at the table, and a very powerful seat at the table, effectively veto power over anything to do relating to the terms of the agreement.
Right.
And some terms of the agreement are specific. So that's clear, and that's great. It's great when there's clarity. Some of the terms are pretty vague, and I don't have the language in front of me, but there's something about that. Yeah, if you go to the IMF draft agreement from December,
Is it a recent tweet of yours?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it in tweets, but
Okay.
but it's vague in that El Salvador must dampen their Bitcoin activity, something to that effect.
Okay.
Right? Like it's not a specific thing.
Right.
So one of the reasons why the IMF is so powerful and so evil is that they write the rules to the game. So if there's a dispute whether El Salvador is following the terms of the agreement, it's up to the IMF. Right?
Okay.
It's not like, like we found a loophole, we found a work. There are no loopholes and workarounds because for specific things, maybe, but for vague terminology, which they always include in all of their agreements, the IMF is the judge, jury, and executioner.
Right. But you'd have a lot of the pro-Bukele Bitcoin camp that would say, yeah, but you haven't seen a leader as good as Bukele before. Look at the way in which he navigated. I know you're smiling, but just let me try and play this out.
Yeah.
Look at the way in which Bukele got free money from China on he's had stadiums paid for. He's had the National Library paid for, that wonderful 24/7 open library that's full of, it's got kids playing and there's literature everywhere and there's lots of people studying. That was paid for by China as a donation. All he had to do was say some nice things about Taiwan, which we won't go into today. But he has proven on a global stage that he is quite the cunning operator and he is able to manipulate things often to El Salvador's favor. Look at what he's done with the prisons. He's now managing to sort of do paper pay for prisoners coming across from the US. And well, this is also another sign that perhaps El Salvador is a bit financially desperate right now because they're having to resort to these kind of things, which again plays this argument of, well, they need the money because it is a growing country. It has a lot of issues. It's very much a developing country. But point being, Bukele is a bit of a wizard. This guy is a master marketer. He has completely influenced the entire Bitcoin community and went from being like random dude with an iPhone tweeting about buying to suddenly like one of the poster child for Bitcoin adoption globally. So surely there's a way in which he can play this IMF thing to his favor as well, and he'll be able to play the IMF.
So
is that all bullshit? Or
that is all bullshit.
Okay.
So for the first point, I mean, it's important to note that the money from China also has strings, right? Like see what they said about Taiwan before that money came in and see what they say afterwards.
Okay. So that's exactly the same issue then, right? You know, they had a point, and then when it came to being moneyed, like they lost all integrity, and we're like, well, we want the money over our integrity.
So I think I'm not very familiar with the China money and what the strings attached are. This is just common. What China does when they give money, it's the condition is often related to not recognizing Taiwan as independent, that it belongs to China, and they're buying that. China is buying that opinion, right, around the world. So, in the case of the IMF, it's actually much harder. I can't think of anything that would compare to the IMF, that they write the rules, they interpret the rules, like they enforce the rules. There's no wiggle room. The only way to win is to not play. You do not enter the house of the IMF and trick them. It is literally designed to counter that. Right? Like, Bukele wouldn't be the first president to wish that he could change the terms but still get the money, right? They are literally designed around that.
Okay. Is there anything else you think they might be influencing? You know, they've influenced the Bitcoin legal tender law. What's the next step if you're in the IMF? What do you want to change about the country? What are these strings attached to the loan?
Yeah, so I think the most important string attached is that the IMF, until this loan is fully out there, which will be likely until 2029 at the earliest, right? Who knows? Maybe there'll be another loan, there'll be other things, but at the earliest, 2029 will be when El Salvador could make their own policy about Bitcoin, totally independent, totally sovereign again.
Okay.
Until then, the IMF has a seat at the table regarding this specific subject matter, because it's part of the terms of anything relating to the terms of the loan. They have a say in now, right? And more than a say. So if El Salvador did something that the IMF determined was counter to the agreement that the two parties had, then they could end the contract, right? They would, and the consequences are pretty severe for that. So one, they would, stop dispersing the loan. But actually, the strongest argument for, and the best rationale for why El Salvador took this was because they need the money. And it's actually not even just about the IMF loan. It will improve their credit rating, right? And an improved credit rating will open up a lot more avenues for funding for El Salvador.
Sovereign wealth funds can look at El Salvador.
Sovereign wealth funds. Yeah, I mean, like, I get it, right? From a pragmatic perspective, it makes sense. This is going to open up more avenues for funding for El Salvador. However, if the IMF is like, oh, they broke the terms of our agreement and we had to stop payment, that rating is worse than it was before. It's terrible. Nobody will give them money if they're like, yeah, we gave them money, but they broke the terms. So they can't. They cannot break the terms. And again, that is interpreted by the IMF, not by you, not by me.
To what extent is this Bitcoiners' fault? And by that, I mean, legal tender law 4 years ago now, supposedly loads of Bitcoiners are going to come over here and, invest and build businesses and all that kind of thing. And yes, that has been the case to an extent. But ultimately, I made a video the other day about how 27 shops I surveyed in this shopping center, only 3 of them really accepted Bitcoin. So it means that Bitcoin isn't really being used. It means that Bitcoiners that come here as well, and I've got lots of sort of hearsay and secondhand evidence of Bitcoiners not spending sats, and they move here from the US or whatever. They're not using it as money. So to what extent is it Bitcoiners' fault that, so you're the president of Bukele, you look at Bitcoiners as a new investment vehicle, much the way you'd look at, I don't know, the renewable energy sector, if you opened up that sort of thing, or drilling oil or whatever it is. You see it as a new industry that's going to help your country grow, a country that desperately needs growth and needs investment. All these Bitcoiners come over, and To be honest, a lot of them are just looking to escape their own developed countries and just want to live freely on the beach. Some of them might make some investments here and there, but ultimately it's just been a load of sort of freedom maxis coming over and not really circulating sats. So 4 years later, you review it and you think, actually, a 1.4 billion loan from the IMF makes a lot more sense than pandering to this Bitcoiner community that, let's be honest, has just been taking more than it's actually been contributing. So ultimately, it's on Bitcoiners. We should have done more for the 4 years to make Bitcoin country more of a success. I know I'm asking this question to the guy who founded a non-profit Bitcoin education program that's now nationwide, but do you see what I'm trying to entertain these ideas?
Yeah. I'm trying to see if I could piss off more people right now. So I think I see what you're saying. I think part of it is time. It takes a lot of time to see the fruits of the labor that are happening here. So El Salvador in August 2021, before the legal tender law went into effect, adoption was zero, right?
Yeah.
Outside of Bitcoin Beach, which is there was good adoption there, but that was a village, right? It's actually grown tremendously since then. That was a village. It was here in San Salvador, in the capital. It was very, very close to zero adoption, zero knowledge, zero education, zero infrastructure. And there's still maybe, I think it's fair to say that it's low now, but it's not zero. And the hardest thing is to get off of zero. The hardest thing is that, the first percent, the second, the third, the fourth. And that actually has been accomplished in this time. So I don't think that, so on the one hand, I don't think that we should be that critical of the progress made for Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador in the past 3.5 years, because this is a process. It's slow, and we need to acknowledge that things like this can't happen overnight. They take time. And the trend was in the right direction. However, at the same time, and maybe this isn't exactly what you were saying, but I think it's relevant. There are lessons to learn, right? There are things that if we could go back in time, what would we have done differently? And the answer should be lots, right? And I'm not saying that as a critique of the country or people that have been active in the space or people that have been inactive in the space or anyone, right? That is not a critique. That is just a reality that you could always do things better. You could always learn lessons, especially if you're trying to forge new ground and pioneer new things, which El Salvador was doing. There's always going to be lessons to learn. And I think that is something that maybe I am disappointed within this larger community. It seems like many people don't want to acknowledge that mistakes were made, that we could have done things differently, and it would have led to a better result. Because that should be like a baseline assumption that everyone could agree with. And I'm disappointed that some people seem to not want to acknowledge that, not want to acknowledge, like, it's not perfect, right? We could have done things better. We could have had more adoption by this point. We could have had, a less, El Salvador could have been in a place where very possibly or very likely, and I'm saying very likely because the government hasn't really communicated very well about this. Very likely they just didn't have a choice. They were painted into a corner. They needed money, and these are the people that had money. Could the country have done something differently to avoid this? I mean, we could always do better, right? We could always do better. We could always learn from our mistakes. We could always see obstacles, unseen obstacles that maybe, slowed things down or set us off, put us on the wrong path that we had to revert to. There are always these things that happen. And I think it's really important that El Salvador is a place that we can learn from. Not that everything is perfect and you can't criticize things. And like, I really worry about that mentality.
Yeah.
Like, don't criticize it because
it's bullshit.
you're like, that's how we're going to improve. That's how we're going to do better.
And within that, it's the don't criticize it, and also just don't even refer to the thing happening.
Yeah.
And it's like, dude, that's toxic positivity. Like the Bitcoin
That
space
doesn't
is
help.
incredibly positive and optimistic, but it should not.
That doesn't help.
Yeah, it's coming. Okay, let's bring ourselves out of this funk by doing the lightning round. The lightning round with everyone. It's a bit of fun. And
Ready.
First thing that comes into your head. So, can pineapple go on a pizza?
Yes.
Very good. Bits, sats, or bitcoins?
Sats.
What's one thing Bitcoiners need to do better as a community?
Education.
What would you ask Satoshi Nakamoto if you could?
Nothing.
Nothing. All right, nothing. If you weren't working on Bitcoin, what would you be doing?
I'd be a journalist, probably. I'd
Not-
probably be on the other side of the
Okay.
table here.
Coming for my job, but not gardening.
Ooh, well.
John's a gardener, by the way. I learned this morning.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, journalism's fine, but gardening, that's
Dude, gardening needs way better journalists. Just like Bitcoin and gardening.
Combine them. Okay.
Okay. Where will the Bitcoin price hit during this bull run? And it can be a range.
I don't care.
Great. And what is your favorite Bitcoin meme?
Ooh. So my favorite Bitcoin meme is the one from The Matrix.
Yeah.
Where I think Neo is asking, so you're saying one day, oh man, I'm forgetting the meme, so maybe you could help me. You're saying one day I could
sell this Bitcoin for $1 million?
Yeah, I could sell this Bitcoin for $1 million, whatever. And the response being, no, I'm saying one day you won't have to.
Yeah. Spend your Bitcoin. It's brilliant. Because Bitcoin will become the money and will become legal tender, one would assume. And it won't be repealed 4 years later. So what's been the impact of this on the sort of local Bitcoin community? Because I think there's a lot of people sat in grey cities all around the world looking out the window and being like, God, I wish I was in Bitcoin country right now. Yeah. And now they see this and like, actually, where am I going to go? Where am I going to daydream about now?
Yeah. So how are people feeling here? Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's mixed feelings. I get a lot of messages because I've been outspoken about this of people that live here that are, well, I got different types of messages, but focusing on the positive ones. We're like, thank you for speaking up because I am really disappointed by this as well, and I don't know what to do. Are you thinking about moving? I don't know if I want to stay here. Like, what's the future gonna hold? Like, what is this a bump in the road, or is this a pivot? Right. And I think that's what a lot of people are asking. Is this a bump in the road, or is this a pivot?
Okay.
And it's too early to say. Right. Like, we don't know.
Yeah.
We'll know a lot more in the next months whether this is a bump in the road or a pivot.
Okay. And do you think this will discourage other countries from making, because, we had the El Salvador law, then we had Central African Republic adopting Bitcoin as legal tender. I know that it was followed by Sango coin and a shit coin. And now the president has only just recently released his own meme coin.
Yeah.
CAR or CAR coin.
Yeah. Things could be worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. But there's also something to be said for politicians embracing Bitcoin, leveraging the Bitcoin community, and then stabbing them in the back. You had Trump talking at Bitcoin conferences and being a Bitcoiner, all this nonsense.
And then he launched a shitcoin.
He launched the shitcoin the day after he was voted in.
2 days before it was inaugurated.
2 days before it was inaugurated, yes. The Grift is incredible. And then you have the CAR doing the Central African Republic doing pretty much the same thing. Okay, the Central African Republic is indebted, up to its eyeballs and is really struggling. El Salvador, you could make this argument too.
Yeah.
But, you've got the same thing happening on this global stage. So what does it say to whether or not we should be cheering on politicians and policy generally?
Yeah, well, El Salvador was a really interesting place because there was adoption from both sides, from the bottom up and from the top down.
Yeah.
And this was always true, but it just really highlights it, that the real change is going to come from us.
Yeah.
It's not going to come from some politician. In fact, that's part of the problem. Us thinking that somebody else will make the change is part of the problem. That's us not taking control of our own future, defining our own destiny, right?
Okay.
Like I think it's one of the root problems of the world today is somebody else will do it.
Yeah, no, big time. It's the curse of the West right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Reliance on others. And there was this sense of, there's a sense of autonomy, and it's not necessarily individualism, because I'm not a big believer in it. I like the idea of community oriented, and that's what a lot of the cool grassroots Bitcoin initiatives in El Salvador are like. I focused a lot on my reporting here about the top-down approach and how ultimately it's failed. And there are many reasons why it's failed, but then you can point to successes of, My First Bitcoin, Berlin, the new circular economy there. You've got El Sonte, where Bitcoin use is still thriving. It's a different equation over there. But what does this mean long term? I wanted to finish off personally with you. Like, what does this mean for you personally in terms of El Salvador? Is it still going to be home in a few years' time? Are you thinking of moving somewhere else with your time and your energy?
It's too early to say.
Okay, but it's not a definitive no.
I moved here for a specific set of conditions, which I'm not sure if they're still true.
Right. Okay. Yeah. You moved here for Bitcoin legal tender, and it's not.
I moved here because El Salvador, more than Bitcoin legal tender, I moved here because El Salvador was pushing the envelope in terms of Bitcoin, that they were in this frontier space.
Yeah.
It's too early to tell, but I am definitely not convinced that that will continue to be true.
Okay. Have we talked the IMF thing to death? Can I change gears and talk about some of the funding stuff, or do you want to say something else on the IMF?
The IMF is the enemy. The IMF
loud and clear, mate.
Will always be the enemy.
Yep.
I am interested in Bitcoin specifically to help create a world where institutions like the IMF do not exist, where they become irrelevant.
Yeah.
F the IMF.
I think you can swear on this pod.
Okay, fuck the IMF.
Nice.
It's your pod. You should know.
Oh yeah, it's right. Good stuff. New rule. Okay, let's not censor that. Yeah, as you say at the start, Bitcoin changes how you relate to power. And the IMF is this ultimate power. Okay, I know I've got a flight in 4 hours, and I'm starting to get that mild travel anxiety. So let's talk about the problem of the funding in the Bitcoin space. We had a conversation offline before coming onto this podcast.
Yeah,
and we were concerned about how centralized effectively funding is. As someone who literally works to get funding full time, I'm not talking about myself, by the way. But it does feel like that sometimes. Let's get your sort of evaluation of the landscape of funding in the space before we go a bit deeper. So how would you evaluate the landscape of funding in Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I'm really worried that Bitcoin won't learn the lessons of the fiat world. So back to journalism. I was a journalist for a decade before starting my first Bitcoin. And I got into journalism because of the ideal of it, because it's a way to speak truth to power. Why many Bitcoiners do not like journalists today, present company aside.
No, they don't like me, mate. We just found someone downstairs. Anyway, that's a story for another time.
Is because it's been co-opted by the funding model, right? Yes. Like, a journalism has, and again, there's exceptions to this, right? This is not a blanket statement that applies to every journalist. But as an industry, journalism has been co-opted by its funding sources. It no longer speaks truth to power. It now speaks for power, right? And that power when people think of power, they think of like, oh, well, they're not shilling the government or like large corporations. They're shilling consumerism, right? Like, they're shilling the status quo rather than challenging it. They're they become part of it.
Yeah.
And I think Bitcoin is vulnerable to the exact same forces of being co-opted by its funding. So the way that funding works in the Bitcoin space now, there's a variety of different ways that it works. I mean, it could just be a for-profit. It could be like a business, right? So maybe it makes more sense for me to speak specifically about the example of running a Bitcoin nonprofit.
Yeah.
So we don't charge for education. We've taught 40,000 students in person here in El Salvador since we began. We've created lots of open source materials which are used around the world. Like, we work directly with educators in more than 30 countries around the world. And all of it is free, right? We don't believe in creating barriers to entry for Bitcoin.
Right.
But we've got expenses, so we need funding. If it's not coming from our students, it needs to come from something else. So I'll put this in 4 broad categories where the funding could come from. One would be corporations, so it's like sponsorships from corporations. A second is grants. A third is grassroots, so that's like individual donors, community, you could say. And the fourth is government.
Right. Yeah.
So as a point of principle, we've never taken money from the government.
Yeah.
And on the topic of funding will eventually capture you. Whoever your funding source is on a long enough timeline will capture you.
I don't think you're going to get any funding from the government anytime soon either.
We don't want it.
Yeah.
We never have. We've always rejected that from this government or any other government. And that it is not a coincidence that I am able to speak so freely against a government policy.
Right.
If we were getting funding from the government, my tone would be different.
Yeah.
Listeners,
take note of people who have been able to speak freely and who haven't. Read between the lines.
This is important. Like, people, this is real. This isn't just a theory. This is real. Look at how people speak about the sources from which they are funded. There is always self-censorship, right? So rather than deny that, we should be conscious of it. And you need money, you need funding. So let's talk about the different categories. We have gotten some sponsorships. Last year it made up 1% of our budget was sponsorships. This year it's 0. It might continue to be 0 because that comes with more strings attached than we like. Again, we are particularly vulnerable to this as a introductory education outfit because we are the first step that people take in, and always what corporate sponsors want is they want to increase their bottom line, right? So like, we've been asked, like, hey, we want to give you money, but like, we noticed that you don't mention our product. Would you? And the answer is no. I mean, the answer is like, if we want to, but it has nothing to do with this money. But we just got tired of having those conversations, right? So that's another one, and that's another category is grants, which is things like Human Rights Foundation. They give grants. OpenSats gives grants. We get grants from both of them. Those are maybe the two most well known in the space.
And then no strings attached.
They are no strings attached.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you don't get any money from Tether, and Tether is, of course, one of the biggest Bitcoin funding platforms. Like, it is. I know you're laughing, but like Tether is run by Bitcoiners. This is my opinion, of course. Other people will say no, it's run by USDT shills, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. Paolo is, in my opinion, a Bitcoiner, but it is true that a lot of Tether money filters down in the form of different companies and different vehicles into Bitcoin educational platforms or Bitcoin journalists like myself. I am inadvertently if you follow up the ladder, because Plan B Network, my biggest sponsor, that is, I think, owned, or at some point it comes down from Tether.
Funded by Tether, yeah.
Just going to preface this by saying Tether's a shitcoin. Don't buy Tether. Obviously, don't buy Bitcoin, earn Bitcoin. But Tether's obviously a shitcoin. Like, I'm not a paid shill. I haven't manufactured my consent. All this nonsense that you have to say to get the idiots online to realize that, there is still a level of freedom. However, they do pull a lot of the strings with funding, right?
Yeah.
Let's say.
Yeah, that is very fair to say. And I think that is very dangerous. Like, I have a lot of respect for what you do. And I am sure that they are not influencing your content now.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that it's not a danger, though.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there are two powers that this has over an individual or a project. There's getting money in the first place, and then there's keeping it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you want to control someone, very often you give them something that they want, let them get comfortable with that, and then threaten to take it away.
Precisely. It's a tricky one. I'm really sorry to have to cut this short, but I think I just literally Googled the traffic, and I'm very, very nervous about if I miss that flight, I'm so dead, man.
Yeah.
Like 4 flights following it. Is there anything we can, I know we want to talk about this a bit longer with the funding. Maybe we can pick this up next week.
Yeah. So just like knowing that on a long enough timeline, we will be co-opted by whoever funds us. Our majority funding source is the community.
Yeah.
It is Grassroots. And we want to be captured by the community.
Nice.
Right? Knowing that we're going to be captured, we want to speak for the community. We want to represent them. We have no problem with being captured by the community. In fact, we're Bitcoiners. We're funded by Bitcoiners, and we want a future that is for all Bitcoiners, not for the bottom line of a specific Bitcoin company.
Yeah, nice. No loans from the IMF anytime soon to my first Bitcoin.
Never.
There's going to be a QR code on my face right now if you want to send some sats to My First Bitcoin and to support the community's work. John is the full-time gardener for My First Bitcoin. He also founded the company. And all that's left to say is I'm sorry I had to cut this short, but yeah, the traffic's not looking good. A really quick shout out to Plan B Network, the best place to learn about Bitcoin. It's free to use, doesn't require any data from you. You just go on there and learn about Bitcoin. It's totally free, as I mentioned. And the other person to thank is Coin Corner. Coin Corner is a British-based Bitcoin exchange, and they've been going for more than 10 years now. So they're pretty good at what they're doing. And of course, they are Bitcoin only. Thanks so much for watching. Hope to catch you on a podcast very soon. Fuck the IMF, and do what you love and save in Bitcoin.